Hello, welcome to this week's episode of WaffleByte. We're your hosts, Sourish
and Kuan. You can find links to our articles in the description, but for now, enjoy the show.
In today's episode, we bring you 3 exciting tech stories, including
Fortnite back on phones around the world, Zuck's green statue of his wife,
and a look at how Walmart grew into the world's biggest company thanks to a hardy farm boy.
The thought of this episode is Elon is publicly arguing with governments on X. Is that good for the platform's business?
So let's dive straight into the episode.
Our first story is about Fortnite. Fortnite has come back on Android devices globally, and it is back on iOS devices in the European Union. So 4 years ago, Epic Games, which makes Fortnite, started a row with Apple and Google over the payments, because Apple and Google both take 30% of all the microtransactions through the app, because that's their App Store policy. So then they started arguing that they should be able to allow people to put money into their Fortnite account outside of the app and on their own website. However, recently, the European Union passed a law stating that third-party app stores must be allowed as part of their massive antitrust overhaul. And so they're now able to get back on the app and start having external pricing so that people can put money into their Fortnite account without having to pay 30% to Apple. Similarly, Spotify is also now able to display pricing. So previously, when you try to look at the different subscription options in Spotify, you could only see individual, family, student, etc. But you couldn't see how much Spotify were charging for it because of this rule. But now you can see the pricing of each of the plans. You can also see that if you want to sign up, you can go to the Spotify website. Interestingly, they don't allow Spotify to display Spotify.com and to link it, but otherwise they're able to direct users to their website to sign up to Spotify.
The 30% payment cut that Apple and Google both take, I think that kind of makes sense because it's almost like when you're in a physical store, that physical store will take a cut of every product that they sell. And they do that in terms of marking up the product price when they sell it. And so this is kind of the same thing, but in a digital format, in a digital world. However, I think 30% is quite large because unlike a physical store, you do have to kind of build the store and physically stock things and physically employ people. I think with digital products, it's much easier to distribute your product. And so what I mean by that is that Spotify, for example, can sell millions and millions of subscriptions digitally, whereas that's much harder to do, of course, with a physical product. And the scale is much easier with technology. And so I think the 30% cut is a bit too high of a cut. I think something like 10 to 15, maybe even up to 20% is much more reasonable. And I think if these 2 big tech companies had originally set the cut down to 10 or 15%, then maybe this whole row wouldn't have occurred in the first place. And maybe in the long run, Apple and Google would be the winners, taking such massive cuts.
I think your point about the physical store is a bit dubious because say you buy an iPhone, right? If you buy it through a physical store, it's the same price as if you buy it directly from Apple. Now, if you buy it directly from Apple, that's direct to consumer. So you don't have the physical store taking a cut and etc. So Apple ends up making more money and the physical store obviously makes no money. But in this case, there's no infrastructure needed. So obviously Google build their Play Store infrastructure. But in terms of the microtransaction, that's not really relevant to Google or Apple. And so I think that it doesn't make sense for the microtransaction to incur a 30% fee to either Google or Apple. I think that's quite ridiculous, especially because all they had to do was approve the app and just get the cash rolling in. So I'm very much in favour of this situation where more money can go to the developer as opposed to Apple and Google, because I don't think they do enough to justify their huge 30% cut that they're taking.
I'm also happy that the developers or the end companies will end up getting a bigger cut of the revenue. However, I don't necessarily agree when you say that Apple and Google aren't within their rights to take a cut, because they've created this whole platform, they've created this whole idea of a smartphone, and they've distributed it to billions and billions of people in the world. They've created a platform for companies like Spotify and other smaller developers to have revenue in the first place. But of course, I think the issue perhaps lies in the fact that this is a duopoly. These 2 companies, they can set really high cuts, like 30%, and there's nothing you can do about it because you either go to iOS devices or Android devices. But even if you go to just one of them, you're then skipping out billions of potential users. So I think The fact that these big companies have so much control, that's the core issue, whereas the cut itself isn't necessarily a huge issue in my eyes.
Our second topic is concerning Google, and actually quite a lot happened this week regarding Google. First up, the first landlord of Google, Susan Wojcicki, died aged 56 from lung cancer last week, and it's widely mourned by the tech community and by us because she's done quite a lot for Google and for the wider tech landscape in general. So she started off her career at Intel doing marketing, and subsequently, after buying her first house, became a landlord, and Google's founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin paid her $1,700 a month to start their company in the Wojcicki garage. She then became the 16th Google employee because the founders convinced her to join, and she was very instrumental in distributing Google to more users by putting Google on different websites so that the search engine could obviously show its potential. She then started building up the AdSense business of Google, which of course still makes up a vast majority of their revenue to this day. And she became the CEO of YouTube in 2014 and promoted advertising on YouTube to make it what we can only assume is to be quite profitable today.
See, I don't know about that because Google don't make the figures about YouTube and particularly their profitability very public, even though they're a public company. They don't actually share that precise information about the company. So I'm wondering how profitable really is YouTube? And of course, it's successful, it's huge. And even if YouTube itself loses money, I'm sure the data they collect from it feeds into their AdSense business overall. But I'm not sure whether YouTube itself is profitable for Google.
Yeah, it's interesting because video storage costs so much money, especially in 4K these days. Although I think is that premium only? I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so only people like me can watch videos in 4K. But you would only assume, because of how many people use YouTube, given that it's basically a monopoly, really, there's no alternative video platform in terms of user-created videos, that they would have enormous amounts of ads, and these ads, we know, of course, are very profitable, given that streamers like Netflix and Disney have been putting ads into their cheapest tiers to subsidize the cost. So surely they wouldn't be draining billions of dollars every year. I suppose it would still make sense if they were, but I would suspect that if they were actually losing money significantly, that they would have taken extra steps to increase their revenue and or cut their costs.
I think they are trying to increase their revenue because, as you've just pointed out, the 4K is now only available to premium subscribers. And I think they're going to try and push more and more features available to only paid subscribers to try and drive that recurring revenue there.
Next up, still discussing Google, according to Bloomberg and the New York Times, the United States Department of Justice is considering making Google sell off AdWords and their Chrome browser as part of the antitrust investigation that they're doing on Google. So AdWords is a Google search ads business, so selling it off presumably would allow other companies to bid for ads in Google search, because currently all the ads you see come from Google, so they set the pricing, etc. So they're arguing that perhaps that's monopolistic. And Chrome, of course, isn't revenue generating itself, but obviously subsidized by Google search, because your default search engine on Chrome would be Google, and it collects loads of your browsing data to help better target ads. So it's just part of their whole ad business. And Google, I think, also pays other browsers, such as Firefox and Opera, to make Google the default search engine on those browsers, which I understand is a pretty significant part of the browser's funding, because, as I said, browsers don't generate revenue themselves.
Yes, I'm a Firefox user, and I know that Google pay Mozilla over $500 million every year, which is not a lot to Google, but it's a huge amount for Mozilla. That's pretty much all of their funding. And so it's kind of, you're in a weird position because alternatives to Google Chrome, or I guess more fundamentally Chromium-based browsers, those alternatives like Firefox can really only exist if Google funds them. And so if you kind of remove Chrome from Google, then are Google now going to be less willing to try and fund alternative browsers? And in this case, it's almost like Google is trading off having more competition for browsers in favor of having less competition for search engines by making Google the default search engine on Firefox. But I think overall, I think that's one of the most positive things Google is doing.
I don't think companies really care about competition in the browser space, because if I was a company, I would look at making a browser and think that I'm not really gaining much here, unless I'm Google or perhaps Meta, who have big ad businesses. I can't really gain much because you're probably not going to pay for a browser. So if it's a free browser, well, I'm essentially just losing money by having to develop this browser. Also, if Google is not allowed to pay other browsers and other people like Apple and like Mozilla who make Firefox, as you said, then they're not really going to use Bing. So what do? Maybe Apple can develop their own search engine. I suspect that it would be pretty successful, given that if it wasn't successful, Apple wouldn't release it. However, most people, you would think, would still prefer Google than whatever Apple's going to come up with. And similarly with Firefox, people are still going to use Google because they're not going to use Bing, because Bing is even worse than Google. So in a weird way, do you think that if Google has to spin off AdWords and Chrome, Google itself would be more profitable because it would still make the same amount of money without having to pay Apple $20 billion a year?
That's a tough question because Chrome must give Google a lot of data. And I guess importantly, through Chrome, Google can push their own services. Having used Chrome myself, things like Google Drive and the whole Google suite is generally much more pleasant to use in Chrome than it is in Firefox, for example. But I think that there might be a point there because, yes, there is, as you say, there is no competition to Google, the search engine. And so why do they even bother creating Chrome? They already developed Chromium, which is the open source backbone for most web browsers. So perhaps Chrome is just a waste of money.
I think that these DOJ rulings, aside from the fact that they get stuck in court because of appeals and things like that for a long time, I don't think they actually end up changing the big tech landscape very much. And in this case, I don't think that what they would do would really affect Google and its parent Alphabet in a materially significant way. I also think that in these cases it's tricky because of how difficult it is to create search engines, and web browsers, as we discussed, are unprofitable. You don't really generate competition. I suppose in the ad business you do, but overall I think that it's not as impactful as lawmakers would like.
I think this ruling comes far too late. It's already so late that Google already has by far the best product, and other companies simply aren't going to be able to compete. If this was 5-10 years ago, there is potential that other companies could come in, but now it's too late.
Finally, on Google, last week Google released the Pixel 9 series of phones, and I think that from my perspective, they're just minor hardware improvements, a $100 price bump, and there were some funky AI features. I think that one thing that looked the most interesting to me was this thing called Add Me, which is where when in a situation where you want a group photo but nobody's available to take the photo because then they wouldn't be in the group, you can take pictures with everyone except one person, and then somebody else would take a picture of this one person and Google would kind of stitch the image together. Now, I think that it's not going to work. Sourish, what do you think? Do you think that this will actually work? Because it's a nifty feature, but it depends on it actually working.
I think the idea is superb. This is a type of thing that I come across pretty much any time I'm on a holiday or in a touristy place, because there's always going to be people who are together but need a photo, and so someone else they take a member of the public and ask them to take a photo for them. But it's much easier if you can just take the photo yourself by using Google's Add Me feature. But I do agree, because I've seen the samples from the initial impressions, reviews, and videos so far that have been published, and we don't see like a particularly impressive ending photo, right? You can still clearly tell that there's something going on here, and I think at least in today's setting, Google's technology is not yet there, but I think there is promise for it to be incredibly useful in the next 1, 2, or even 3 years.
I just hope it gets better, because when I ask other people to take a picture for me, they tend to suck, and it's really annoying, because as somebody who enjoys taking photos, I don't want my pictures to suck. But of course, with Google's feature, that also sucks at times at the moment. I saw a picture where they were taking a picture of two people, so they took turns taking pictures, and one guy's foot ended up being on top of the other guy's foot, as if he was stepping on the other guy, and that's awful as well. So we don't really have a good option for this problem at the moment. So I suppose it's more likely that Google will get better compared to the random guy in the tourist hotspot. So yeah, certainly I, for one, hope that this gets better, but right now it still seems like it sucks.
We ultimately are in still the very early days of AI, especially from an end user perspective. So I'm almost positive that this will get better, especially because it now seems the battle for the operating systems is all around the AI and not the features outside the AI.
Next up, Mark Zuckerberg, or Zuck as most people call him, is in the news again, and
I actually call him the Zuck.
this time it's for him commissioning this 7 feet statue of his wife. So his wife's clearly very important to him, it seems, and the statue, which is 7 feet, so it's quite tall, it's over 2 meters. It's in this, in my opinion, ugly green colour, but it does have a cool silver cloak over it. It appeared to be under a tree, and one of the reasons was apparently that he wanted to bring back the Roman tradition of making statues of your partner. So, Sourish, would you make a 7 feet statue for your future wife?
I think that's a tough question because I'm very far from the stage where I both have the money to spend on a 7 foot statue.
Yes, apparently it cost 20 grand, 20,000 US dollars, so it's certainly not cheap. But I suppose it's quite good value in a way because jewellery can cost that much, and it's certainly much bigger than jewellery and much more, loud and in your face.
I almost wonder if this is perhaps the Zuck's method of getting more publicity. Because as a public figure, you always want to create yourself and put your face in the news as much as you possibly can. Whether it's good or bad, all publicity is good publicity. And of course, the Zuck hasn't got anything recently to put his face in the news for. And that perhaps explains why he's changed his hairstyle and added that gold necklace or that gold chain. And maybe this is just the next thing he can do to throw himself into the news cycle.
Yeah, I think most people liked it. Apparently he's been called a wife guy now, so I guess that's great for him, especially given the fact that he's been in the news for other less pleasant things. But yeah, I think it's a bit strange, if I'm honest.
I guess to counter that, an argument could be made. They almost he is objectively objectifying his wife as a statue. And I think there's nothing inherently wrong with creating the statue of your wife, but it perhaps isn't necessarily the most progressive thing you could have done. And especially in a world where we're trying to advocate for more sex inequality, gender equality, and women's rights, I think this maybe isn't necessarily the best message for such a public person to be putting out there. But equally, I haven't seen many people make that take compared to the take you've just said of being the Zuck being a great wife guy.
The thing that baffles me the most is that if we consider statues like Winston Churchill, which, okay, he's controversial apparently because of various things he did, but most people appreciate him. And when he's in the middle of the street, most people can appreciate the statue. Whereas with Zuck's wife, I would suspect that most people, firstly, don't know who Zuck's wife is, and most people, wouldn't care. So if it's there in the public, it's just a bit strange because you're the only one who really appreciates it. But I guess it's cool if it makes him happy.
His wife also seems absolutely delighted in the photo that he posted online.
And finally, what I think is the best news this week is that Crowdstrike has accepted an award for the most epic fail. So if you've been living under a rock, a while ago, Crowdstrike pushed this software update to devices which had their software enabled, which was a lot of devices around the world, and it caused some issues because it bricked the systems, and we saw people stranded at airports, people were struggling all over the place. But recently in a conference, the CEO of Crowdstrike publicly accepted an award for most epic fail, and he cited a need for people to know that such a disaster can't happen again. And I think that is a great move there because you're accepting the fact that you messed up and you're hopefully trying to fix it, which lots of companies don't do. And I think it's great publicity for them. It's quite cool. It makes people appreciate them a bit more.
Crowdstrike, they portray themselves as a very almost young, energetic, family type of company. If you look at how they treat their employees, it's extremely good, and it's almost like they're all just in this gangster friend style vibe thing. And so I think this comment that the CEO made kind of feeds into that overall idea of what type of company Crowdstrike is. And I think at least maintaining that consistency is good. Now, I also think that there's nothing that Crowdstrike can say to defend themselves in this situation. They objectively did mess up, and there are a few somewhat basic mistakes that they could have taken precautions for, and they did affect so many people. But I also wonder, is this even in the slightest motivated by the fact that, for example, Delta, as we discussed last time, are considering suing Crowdstrike, and the government is investigating Crowdstrike, and Crowdstrike has so much, I guess, ironically, they have so much surface area that people are now going to attack them for. So perhaps is this just a comment to try and accept that responsibility as soon as possible in the public and kind of avoid people remaining annoyed at CrowdStrike and therefore pursuing action against CrowdStrike?
I don't think so, because if I was an engineer who had to stay up all weekend to reboot systems, if I saw CrowdStrike in the news again, I'd be more annoyed. I wouldn't be less annoyed. And if I was similarly an airline customer who got stranded at a random airport, I would be more annoyed probably if I saw CrowdStrike in the news again. But I think that it does show that they're accepting responsibility and there's a level of accountability within the organisation. I think that's good PR, but I don't necessarily think it will make people less annoyed at their huge fail.
Honestly, with this whole situation that CrowdStrike created, taking a step backwards, they've actually done a pretty good job. Because if you look at other companies and when other companies have failed to do something or done something really badly, the initial reaction is almost always, nope, that's not us. Nope, there's some other reason this happened. It's not us, blah, 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 blah. Whereas CrowdStrike, they kind of immediately recognized that there was a problem with their software and it's on their end. And they immediately tried to get the problem fixed. And so even if there was just a lack of competency, at least they were immediately there to say, yes, this is our fault, as opposed to really just backtracking because of all the public outcry, which did not occur in this case, which I think is very good.
Yeah, I suppose, though, when the problem's so big, you can't really brush it under the rug. You can't escape responsibility if it's, clearly a huge error. Whereas with a smaller problem or controversy, you can sort of blame other people and say that we did nothing wrong, etc. And so I suppose it works better in those scenarios. But yes, overall I agree that the CrowdStrike has handled this quite well considering what happened.
Who hasn't handled this well, though, is Microsoft. And they've been very, very defensive and still are. And I believe even a few days ago, they blamed the government. I think it was they blamed the EU government for this issue, which is kind of crazy. They basically said something along the lines of, because of how these laws are structured, we've had to code Windows in such a way that gave CrowdStrike software this incredible level of access, which is really just not true. That's just not how it really works. And Microsoft are clearly still trying to shove all of the blame to CrowdStrike in this case. But they did at least commit to fixing this apparently non-issue, or I guess adding a new feature into Windows to prevent something like this from happening again.
I think it really sucks for Microsoft, though, because they didn't really do anything wrong, and it was mostly CrowdStrike's fault, if not all CrowdStrike's fault. But they got lots of bad PR as well, because CrowdStrike is associated so heavily with Microsoft Windows systems, and they just sat there. They did nothing wrong, but now they're getting loads of bad PR, and people are really annoyed at them.
In fact, a few months ago, CrowdStrike software had pretty much the exact same issue, but on Linux systems. But because CrowdStrike is mostly an endpoint software, which means it's only used on endpoint devices as opposed to servers, for example, very few devices were affected when it crashed on Linux, and so the world didn't know about it. And I guess just the sheer scale of Microsoft and Windows is what caused Microsoft to get so much blame from the public. Now, let's take a look at how Walmart became the absolute giant that it is today. Walmart was founded by Sam Walton, and Sam Walton was born in Oklahoma in 1980 as the son of two farmers. Then his brother James, whose nickname is Bud, he was born in 1921, and shortly after that, the whole family moved to Missouri. And unfortunately, his family struggled financially throughout Sam's childhood, and Sam would usually work on the farm milking the cows to help his mother's milk business just try and grow just a little bit more. And this hardship instilled discipline and turned Sam into an industrious young boy. In fact, he was active in the Boy Scouts, and he became the youngest person ever in Missouri to become what's called an Eagle Scout, which is the highest rank that a Boy Scout could attain after they've met a set of really rigorous criteria. Sam's father was almost never at home because he was always on the road looking for ways to make an extra dollar. And so Sam saw firsthand how his parents fought for every deal, making small, tiny profits every single time. Because of this, he worked really, really hard to get to college in the hope that he could support his parents financially. And at college, his links with public service remained as an armed forces cadet this time. And in fact, he was noticed as a particularly promising and standout student both in his study of economics and his work with the cadets. Growing up in the Great Depression, Walton was constantly working odd jobs to try and make money here and there, which was actually quite common at the time.
I think what's particularly impressive about that generation of people who grew up in the Great Depression is that they all had to work really hard because there wasn't really a thing that could fall back on. Whereas our generation these days, I feel like we tend to have things easier, and even though we face our own challenges, we perhaps don't work as hard and aren't as cutthroat and ruthless as some of these people who grew up in the Great Depression was, because that was what you needed to do to survive.
And then, when he finally graduated, Sam decided that retail was the industry for him, so he became a trainee manager at a JCPenney store. But back then, JCPenney, they were big, but they weren't absolutely huge. And in fact, they would later become a rival to Walmart. At JCPenney, whilst Sam's bookkeeping was seen as the worst of any employee at that store, his salesmanship is what was so impressive and helped him keep his job. And he earned quite a lot in commission fees just because of his salesmanship. But then in 1942, after just 18 months as JCPenney, he had to quit because he was anticipating being called into the army to help fight in the war. But, of course, being Sam, he was extremely good and people saw something in him. So instead of fighting in the war, he was moved to the army's intelligence unit and very quickly rose through the ranks to become captain. So by the time the war was over in 1945, he was pretty successful, he had a wife, and he began building his family. So at this point, Sam didn't want to continue working in the army, and he wanted a more stable job. So he went to his father-in-law and took a $20,000 loan, and Sam used this money to bought a quite small dying store, and he managed to actually turn it around in just 3 years, and he made enough money to both support his growing family and pay back his father-in-law in just 3 years. But unfortunately, Sam, he was quite young and inexperienced, so disaster struck when his lease ended, and the store, along with its reputation, was handed back to its owners, and Sam lost everything he had worked for. Now, the reason this had happened is because the contract didn't have a renewal agreement, and Walton had annoyed the store owners by finding sneaky loopholes in the contract to run the store the way he wanted, and not the way the owners wanted, even though he was yielding greater profits than the owners ever had. But this essentially meant that he undercut in price by having much lower profit margins and using a more economical supplier, but making up for it in volume, which the store owners just did not like.
I think that shows the culture at the time, which was much more focused on small businesses, family businesses. And I think Walton had this corporate America style that obviously is so ubiquitous nowadays, but he was in some ways probably ahead of his time.
Absolutely. His unorthodox style of business was the reason he succeeded, but also the reason he kind of failed in this case. However, Walton was so absolutely enraged with what happened that he decided he'd do the whole thing again, but better. And, of course, this time, he made sure to not make the same error by ensuring that his lease contract was 99 years. So he bought another store in Arkansas, and he repeated his same formula for success, focusing on cutting costs and offering the very, very, very lowest prices in town. Of course, Walton's strong understanding of core business concepts was absolutely instrumental to this, which he learned in his economics degree. But also his willingness, and this was something that wasn't very common at the time, but his willingness to question those that didn't make sense, like the rules that didn't make sense, is what enabled him to do exceptionally well and outcompete everyone else. So he expanded his new brand into 15 stores across the state, and each time he bought a new store, he used the profits from the previous stores to fund them. And yet, despite earning the equivalent of millions and millions and millions every single year in profits, Walton still thought that he wasn't getting enough money for the hard work that he was putting in. So Walton decided to have one final shot at retail, and this is where Walmart was born. He cranked his ideas up to the extreme and started all over again. Sam went back to the owners of his very first shop that he bought, but they were still incredibly annoyed at him, and they still didn't believe in his business strategy, which involved having razor-thin margins on all of his products. So he was once again annoyed, and he took it into his own hands and recruited his brother, Bud Walton, and they needed money to start up this venture, so they mortgaged their own house, they borrowed a ton of money from banks, and they eventually used this to buy a new big store in Arkansas with the Walmart branding on it. Over the next few years, Walmart grew faster than retail had ever seen, and by 1980, the Waltons were managing to create 100 new stores every single year, which is unprecedented at the time. And did you know, Sam Walton, he was an avid pilot, so he'd fly around America in his little aluminium plane to find new stores, locations, and check in on current ones. And in fact, it's said that one time he flew over a store and saw that the parking lot was empty. So he went down and landed onto the parking lot to check what was wrong with the store and why no customers were visiting it.
I think that's great dedication, and actually, even to this day, Walmart still uses corporate jets quite a lot so that area managers can visit different stores in the area that they manage.
Anyway, when Walmart went public in 1970, the Walton brothers retained 61% of the shares, so they still had most of the control. But importantly, they generated enough money to continue their aggressive expansion and pay back all of the debt the Walton brothers had taken. And in fact, the Walmart stock, it soared in the next years, and it quadrupled in just 2 years. But what made Walmart this successful? It was obviously the things we've already discussed, which is their streamlined supply chain, which allowed for very low prices, because they bought in huge quantities straight from the manufacturers, and they completely cut out the middleman wholesalers. But importantly, Walton also had an eye for cutting costs. For example, he'd use metal shelves instead of wooden shelves, because the metal ones would last longer and were cheaper to buy. But I think the main reason that Walmart did so well and so much better than Walton's previous two store brands was an insight that Walton had from a macro level, which is that he wants to put very, very large stores in very, very small residential areas. And at that time, that was just something that did not exist. And you'd really only get small stores in big cities and small stores in residential areas. And so with these large stores, Walton could leverage economies of scale to offer the best prices to their customers. And ultimately, this is what led to Walton's success. He had a relentless focus on the customer. All Walmart stores offered free parking, they were open longer hours than every other store, and they kept costs as low as possible for the customer. And these three things were just huge features for a customer. Why would you go to another store when Walmart offers all of this for you? And so this way, he managed to undercut every other retail store in cost. And he didn't really sacrifice quality. He still went to good manufacturers and good suppliers. But that didn't come without its issues. So Walton actually admitted in public that Walmart was inevitably going to crush small local stores and businesses, which certainly did draw some distaste towards him. But ultimately, Walmart had cheap prices and consumers like that. When Walton and the Walton brothers ran Walmart, they actually treated their partners and associates really well. It was almost like one big Walmart family, and he was known for sharing his profits, both among his shareholders and his employees, creating this sort of community atmosphere that John Lewis has had for the longest time, but perhaps not as much in recent years. But after Walton died in 1992, and especially since the turn of the millennium, there have been quite a lot of allegations against Walmart. And the biggest one is around Walmart employees, and they're thought to be treated really, really poorly, with managers specifically looking out for any sign of unionization, and they even were given a hotline to senior management to report any sign of unionization so that senior management could shut it down before anything happened. But in recent years, Walmart has continued to raise their minimum wage and their benefits to their employees. However, this is really just against a backdrop of immense public scrutiny as opposed to pure kindness that Sam Walton had. However, Walmart are still supplying items that are proven to be made with slave labor over in Asia. And whenever there is a scandal like this coming out, Walmart tries pretty hard to sweep it under the rug. And unfortunately, it usually works because, as we said, Walmart, they have the lowest prices. So of course, they're going to win the minds of the consumers, regardless of their business practices. In fact, their prices are so low that in Germany, Walmart was fined for undercutting every other retail store's prices, and they were fined so much that they decided that they're just going to go and leave Germany, which I think is quite funny. So whilst Walmart will never return to its incredible prestige of the 1980s, I think the constant public outcry is necessary to at least keep Walmart in check. However, we should just remember that Walmart is ultimately a very large corporation. They have the power to skirt the law, they have the influence, and they avoid over $1 billion in taxes every single year. They even use government subsidies to help them, which feels a bit sketchy because it's almost like their prices aren't that low if a lot of your tax money or some of your tax money goes into helping them keep low prices. But I mean, every large company does this, so can we really be surprised with Walmart? Is this what it takes to be competitive at the scale? I don't know, but what I do know is that Sam Walton had an absolutely incredible story and created this behemoth of a company. Books. I'm currently reading, and I've just started to read, a book called The Design of Everyday Things. It's written by Don Norman, who you may have heard of because he is quite big in this space. He joined Apple as the head of user experience over there, and then later moved on to HP, back when HP was still perhaps a bigger player or more respected in the field. And so he's had a really successful career. And he's really into design and user experience and psychology and understanding the human. How can you design the best experience for your users and your consumers and your customers? And near the start of the book, he refers to this idea called the Norman door. And he didn't name a door after himself, right? It's just that the public named a door after him because of his reputation for hating doors. And he hated doors, or he currently still hates doors, because a lot of doors aren't very intuitive. For example, like, how do you know when to push or pull a door? Perhaps you don't know where the hinge of the door is, so perhaps you push or pull on the wrong side, and of course the door just doesn't move. Or maybe you push in the middle because you don't realize which side it is, and then you're having to exert more efforts just to open or close a door. And he gets really, really frustrated about this. And Kuankuan, have you ever experienced this idea where you just don't know whether you push or pull a door?
I have actually. I do that. I experience that all the time. And I think one reason is that if you're in a corridor, you usually expect doors to open into the room, right? I think there's some reason for that, but I don't know why the reason is. But sometimes the doors open out of the room. And in those cases, because you're usually expecting doors to open into the room, you then start pushing the door, but it doesn't obviously do anything because it's open outwards. And so you look like an absolute fool if you try to do that, and somebody else has been at that door before, just opens the door correctly. And I think that's just not good. Also, some doors have letters written on them, for example, push or pull, but usually some door handles are more inviting to push than to pull. So if you have a big flat door handle, then even though you might write pull on it, people are still incentivized to push because it looks like something you would push, and then you would obviously not open the door, and it would be very frustrating. So yes, I agree that doors are often very poorly designed.
It really doesn't feel difficult just to design a functional door, a door that is quite obvious when you look at it, whether you push or pull it. And it's just annoying that people don't really think about that type of thing because it affects literally millions of people every single day, and for no reason whatsoever other than design negligence.
About 10 years ago, Meta, which was formerly known as Facebook, paid a lot of money to acquire WhatsApp. Now, WhatsApp isn't really profitable, but WhatsApp isn't really known for generating revenue because they don't put very many ads on it, unlike Instagram, which obviously does generate lots of revenue from advertising. So I'm wondering, why did Meta buy WhatsApp? Because yes, there's some WhatsApp for businesses where you can use it as a chat, but also logistics and other functions. But ultimately, it's not pulling in money in the same way Instagram is. And Instagram, which was acquired a couple of years earlier, has now become very successful. So I'm wondering, what is the grand plan for WhatsApp? Is it going to stay like this, or is it going to, at some point, generate a bit more revenue?
We see in developing countries that WhatsApp are trying to kind of capitalize on the fact that in developing countries, there are loads of people that want to start their own small business, their small local business. And how on earth does perhaps you as a small local business owner, how do you spread the word about your business? How do you take payments? How do you advertise? How do you communicate with your customers? And Meta think WhatsApp is the solution they can offer. And I think that's very intelligent because it's clearly a benefit to both the consumers, to Meta, and also to the businesses themselves, because the businesses kind of use or can use WhatsApp as this sort of everything app that they can use to do all of their or many of their business functions all in one app. And Meta can take a cut, or they can charge these businesses to run communities or to run ads, because whilst there aren't ads on WhatsApp, you can actually buy an ads on WhatsApp for Facebook and for Instagram. And so it really seems to me that the Zuck wants to push WhatsApp as this place for businesses to start out. But even then, I recently actually saw much, much bigger communities being advertised to me on my WhatsApp app. I saw communities for massive companies like, probably not Google, but just massive companies that had their own communities. I think Dbrand was one of them, actually. And so maybe Meta are charging those companies to run their own community.
The main thing for me is that I'm not sure if that's actually profitable, because if you want to be something like an everything app, as you said, in developing countries, that takes lots of money and resources and manpower to localize it sufficiently such that it's attractive. Obviously, we don't know the financial details for WhatsApp in particular, but I do believe that actually Mark Zuckerberg probably knows what he's doing, and he's probably going to do something with WhatsApp, because if it's just burning cash, that's really unintelligent.
You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of Threads, the thing that the Zuck launched, I think, just over a year ago. Because Threads is something that not that many people actually use, but because a fair amount of people still use it, pretty much every business that had a Twitter account also then created a Threads account, just because enough people are on that platform for businesses to think it's worthwhile to get on that platform. And I'm wondering if WhatsApp is basically the same thing, where enough people are on WhatsApp such that even if the app itself isn't just really necessary for a business to create a massive community chat on, or announcement chat, the fact that so many people or so many other businesses are also on WhatsApp, perhaps that kind of incentivizes this and kind of creates this chain reaction such that in a few years we'll see almost every single company have their own WhatsApp community or announcement thread.
The thought of this episode was Elon Musk is publicly arguing with governments on X. Is that good for the platform business?
Before we get on to whether this is good for the platform's business, we first need to look at Elon Musk himself. So he is a self-alleged free speech advocate, and this was his entire spiel when he took over Twitter and turned it into X, is to become the platform for free speech. Now, him by saying his opinions is not going against free speech, but what it is doing is it's almost saying, as the owner of this platform, I'm kind of dictating that this is my opinion, and it's almost going to be interpreted as if that's the right opinion. And of course, it is publicly thought that he boosts his own tweets, or X's, whatever they're called, to the rest of the user base. And so his tweets, or X's, have a disproportionately large viewer base compared to everyone else's opinion. And so by him siding with one particular government or attacking one particular government, that perhaps has a much larger effect than it should.
Elon Musk took over the platform X, formerly known as Twitter, with the intention of making it accepting of all voices, and previously conservative voices and people on the right of the political spectrum had thought that their voices were suppressed. Now the problem is, Elon Musk, who's recently shifted from the centre of the political spectrum further towards the right, has made some comments which are widely agreed to be false and simply not true. And I think that's a major problem, because once you have the platform and the voice of Elon Musk, who has over 100 million followers on X, then you're starting to spread lots of misinformation. And rightly so, I think governments are cracking down on misinformation, because that's not ideal. We saw in the UK that there were riots. So I understand why governments are upset about him saying some things which are misinformation. And I think that the free speech argument isn't particularly strong in the cases where you're saying blatantly wrong things.
When Elon took over Twitter, it was clearly not very profitable. I believe it was losing billions every year, and Elon still decided to buy it. And so as soon as he got there, he decided to cut costs as much as possible. He cut the employee headcount by a huge amount. He reduced benefits and all of that stuff. And now we can see he's trying to monetize X as much as possible. So to be verified, you now have to pay. There are now multiple tiers and so on. And he's trying to just create more ad revenue. But ad revenue, of course, only works if you have more and more users to see those ads and interact with those ads. And so perhaps Elon, by creating a more divisive platform, perhaps he's attracting more attention and more media onto Twitter or X, and therefore more users come to X. And if that's what happens, then of course Elon's going to get more revenue. Therefore, Elon showing public opinions strongly towards one party versus the other party perhaps is a great thing for him, because it just means that X becomes more popular and gets more revenue. I think to try and balance both free speech and revenue to make this a sustainable business is an almost impossible task.
The counterpoint to that, though, is that users who are very opinionated and on a divisive platform where you see lots of people arguing with one another tend to post things which advertisers do not want next to their ads. And we see that once Elon took over Twitter, which is now known as X, lots of advertisers decided to pull out and stop advertising on Twitter, because firstly they saw that Twitter was not the greatest place to put ads, and secondly they did not want to be associated with the very divisive nature and some of the things that were happening on Twitter. So in that situation, you're not boosting revenue. In fact, you're decreasing revenue, because advertisers are now pulling out. So you have fewer ads and you sell them for a lower price. So I think the balance that he's striking is probably not great now, because I think you would be happier with having more advertisers compared to having an extra 10 million users, because the advertisers are ultimately where the money comes from, and it's the users which facilitate it. But if you have more advertisers, you can always place more ads, and I think most users don't really notice the difference between 3 and 4 ads, for example.
I'm not so sure about that one, because whilst there have been big brands that have dropped out of using X as a platform for advertising, there is still going to be a huge amount of companies that want their name advertised on X. For example, if you're selling a tech product, as long as you're not like Apple, who are, I guess, selling an experience as opposed to a product. If you're selling a product, say Google, for example, or Samsung, there's not really much issue with advertising on X from their perspective. And so you might lose the very, very top players like Apple, but you're still going to keep like the next level of players willing to advertise on X. And they may not pay as much as Apple, but they might still pay like 90% of what Apple would pay. And I think the increase in users perhaps makes up for that more so than the loss of big advertisers.
We know that before Elon bought Twitter, as it was a public company, it was never really profitable, and in fact it lost billions every year. Now it's a private company, we now are not privy to their earnings information, but I do believe that Elon is trying really hard by cutting costs, as you said, and trying to make sure advertisers don't run away, to make Twitter profitable, because that's obviously advantageous for him, because he owns it and he paid a really large amount of money for it. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next Monday with a new episode.
And remember to follow us on X at the WaffleByte. That's the_WaffleByte. See you there.